So the whole point that we were getting at with this idea of the prospect theory value function was that not only are people risk averse when we're talking about potential gains, that was true in most contexts with most people, even with expected utility theory, but we're also saying people are specifically loss averse. That they hate, one way of putting that is that they hate losses more than they like equivalent gains. Another way of putting that is that they put a higher weight on explicit losses than they do on foregone gains, even though those are two ways of framing the same thing. That, say last class I gave you $10, and then today I take $10 away from you. Rationally speaking, you're just back at zero. We can see that rationally, right? However, if you were in a case where you had psychologically acclimated to having that $10, me taking the $10 away from you today would feel like a loss. And if you're overweighting those losses, you're not going to feel that explicit loss the same as you would if I just said, I could have given you $10 the other day, but I didn't because I'm mean. And that's literally what happened. I could have given you all $10. I chose not to. Psychologically, that feels very different than giving you something and taking it away. Luckily, we're only talking about $10 bills and not a puppy, so it could be worse. But people don't seem to think about explicit losses and foregone gains in the same way, even though logically and mathematically they would be exactly equivalent. So what we did last time, we had this picture of loss aversion, and we said, well, why does this matter, right? And we're going to say, if you think about how this all factors into, willingness to pay for an item, the willingness to accept to give up an item, and so on and so forth, then we can say, if we just think about our value function, we would say, how much would we be willing to pay to get something we considered a gain of X? So will we be able to trade that, or we'd be willing to trade that for something that gave us a value of plus X? Because even if we traded those two things, we would just be back at zero. We'd be back at our reference point. This is weird to think about in this context because so far we've put our gains and losses in terms of dollars themselves, right? And so if we're going to think about the value of those dollars, you're like, oh, that gets a little bit weird. But what we're going to do is think about, a slightly different formulation of this value function. Think about the gains and losses. Think about, plus X would be plus one puppy, and minus X would be minus one puppy. Continue that, line of thinking. If you had your gains and losses not in terms of money themselves, but in terms of, getting stuff and giving up stuff, then it would make a lot more sense to have those values be numerical, dollar valuations. That you could say, this V of plus X would be how much would you pay to get a puppy? And then you could ask a similar question, okay, well, we typically think about your willingness to pay for this puppy as how much you value a puppy. In traditional economics, there's only one valuation. You have one value of that puppy. If you are buying the puppy, you will pay up to that valuation. If the market price of the puppy is above your valuation, you would sell a puppy if you had it. Right? That we assume that symmetry in traditional economics. But this value function implies something very different. That if we were to say, how much would you have to be compensated to give up a puppy that you currently have? Giving up a puppy would be our minus X. You would need to be compensated with something that is the negative value of negative X. Right? Because you would have to be compensated with something with a positive value. So we can think about that in our willingness to pay to get something versus our willingness to accept to get rid of something. Traditional economics assumes that there's no difference between those two things. We talk a lot about like Red Sox tickets, because, we're right here. So, suppose you value, a hypothetical Red Sox playoff ticket at like $100. You'd be willing to pay up to $100 for the ticket. If you had a ticket and someone offered you more than $100, you would then sell that ticket. That's what we assume. This value function is suggesting that that's not exactly true. That we have, we could think about our willingness to pay to get the puppy. We can also think about our willingness to accept, to forego getting a puppy. Notice that not getting a puppy is very different from being given the puppy and then giving up the puppy. That's the whole point that we're making. That how much you would have to be paid to forego a gain of X would be the same as your willingness to pay. Because again, foregone gains. But then we can think about in the loss spectrum, how much would you have paid to avoid a loss of X? Well, you would pay, the negative, obviously, the value of negative X. And this suggests that you would pay more to avoid a loss than you would to get a gain, which is consistent with loss aversion. I would pay more to give, to not have to give up my puppy than I would to get another puppy. Marginal benefits of puppies even aside, right? That's a little bit of a weird example because I've had the dog for, 11 years or whatever. But this is suggesting as soon as you've incorporated that item into your reference point, explicit losses feel very different than foregone gains. So I give you a very simple implementation of this to think about. That this article is actually based on things that happened last year that were pretty hilarious. So you get onto a plane. A lot of you are not actually from Boston. And you may have noticed an issue with the plane seats being really close together. And then you have the person in front of you try to recline the seat. And you're like, wow, I now even have less room than I did before. You all seem like reasonable humans, so I would guess that none of you have been in the situation where your knee-jerk response was to argue with the person, throw a drink on the person, and cause the entire plane to have to land in a random location, and then you'd be dragged off in handcuffs. I'm hoping that none of you actually experienced this, either as the person being dragged off or even the person on the plane, because this is somewhat of an inconvenience. But this actually happened. This actually happened multiple times within a 2-week period. So there were a lot of articles written about this. Some of them were having philosophical debates about who owned that space on the plane. Who had those property rights. Does the person have the right to recline, or do you have, does the person behind have the right to legroom? It's not actually well defined. Ron Coase might have argued that it doesn't actually matter. The people can always bargain to figure, to get to the efficient solution. I would argue there's a button on my seat that allows me to recline. The stewardess does not yell at me if I recline my seat. Those indicate that the right to recline goes to me. But apparently the world doesn't always agree. But the whole idea is that there should be some, traditionally we would assume that there's some willingness to accept symmetry here where people could bargain and get to an efficient outcome. So I asked you, and I am not actually going to poll you because some of you were turning in your discussion questions right before class, so I didn't actually have time to compile them. But I asked you 4 versions of what were in a way all the same question. Right?
I thought that you paid him, and then she comes back and she's like, how much to not complain? And I get up and be like, man, I paid you already. Shut up.
Okay, that's actually reasonable. That's not quite what I meant here. That would be sort of, reneging on your agreement and railroading you into paying more, which is not what I intended. But the Spock person would see these all, semantics and specific, logistical descriptions aside. He would see them all as the same question, right? Mm-hmm. I thought you were going to say something. I can tell you.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at with these questions being the same, but asking what we think is probably because probably different because we're selfish and we think, all right, if someone's doing something to us, to pay them, I don't want to pay that much, but if I'm doing something and someone else wants me to change my behavior, oh, now I want more money for it, probably.
There's some psychology in it in general, and the point that you're making, our Homo economicus, our Spock, has no capacity for any of this, right? Spock doesn't get, I believe the technical term for what you're describing is butthurt. That there's no idea of fairness, there's no idea of spite, there's no, none of that's going on in that calculation. That there's, technically speaking, these aren't four versions of the same question. They're two separate questions. One being how much do you value reclining, and two being how much do you value your legroom, which are technically two separate questions. Because in one case, you're the one that wants to go like this, and the other one, you're the one that wants to stretch out your legs or not be hitting the seat in front of you or whatever. So technically, you could have two, even Spock might have two different valuations here, but Spock would not have four. That Spock would say, well, if I'm willing to pay, say, $20 for the person in front of me to not recline, that means I value my legroom at $20. If I value my legroom at $20 and somebody offers me $21 to not complain when they recline, I would take it. That's what Spock would say. That is not what people say. What people say, and somebody, in a very important line of economic inquiry actually polled people to see what they felt about their airline legroom valuations. And this is what we get. So we want to think about, rationally, which one of these guys should be the same. How should these match up? And do they actually match up? Obviously, that answer is no, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. That we can see the right to recline, the willingness to pay. How much are you going to be willing to pay to recline your seat? Should be, rationally speaking, if we lived in a world of Spocks, the same as the right to recline, willingness to sell. Because that's, willingness to sell and willingness to accept are synonyms, right? And the willingness to sell here is, hey, I'm reclining. All right, how much would you have to pay me to get me to not recline? And if there's one objective value of reclining, these two things should be the same number, right? And we see that they're not. They're even off by more than a factor of 2. We said that we had factor of 2 as a general rule of thumb. Here we're seeing something that's even more different than that. Similarly, Spock would say that these two should be the same. That Spock has one valuation of legroom, and he is willing to pay up to that amount. He's willing to give it up if you pay him more than that.
Aren't the first and last one the same thing?
Well, except for the fact that the roles of the two people are reversed,
But
right?
it's the same thing happening.
If you had two identical people,
Okay, that's
yes.
not kind of how I saw it. Just like different scenarios with me sitting in the plane.
that's what I'm saying. So, I'm not the world's tallest person, for example, right? So, my willingness to pay for legroom, as empirically tested on a number of different flights, is basically 0. Even this stupid pay $40 for extra legroom on JetBlue or whatever, I just won't do it, just because I don't care. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't be willing to pay a decent amount to be able to recline my seat, right? That those two things are fundamentally different consumption items, even though when you have two people, one's consumption item impacts the other one and vice versa, right? But there's no reason that my valuation of the legroom and my valuation of my right to recline should be the same. I was on a flight to London, and it was seriously for extra legroom and extra width. It was an extra $800. People pay this, apparently. And I actually I said to my significant other, I'm like, how much do you value me sitting next to you? Because I'm hoping you say a number less than $800, and I actually sat in Coach and he sat in Economy Plus. He's taller than me, so it makes sense that he would have a different valuation. But, you know, I would pay far more to recline than I would for someone else not to recline. That there's no inherent link between those things, but there are inherent links between, you know, giving up the legroom versus paying to get the legroom. Mm-hmm.
Would you consult your fellow travelers to see what the market cost of your recline room is?
So, say that again, actually.
So the guy in front of you would pay a little more or less. The guy behind you might pay more. Then you could charge more based on that. And then so it's like everyone on the plane is charging more or less. If you find the guy charging the most, and the guy in front of you might charge less. You can figure out like on that scale.
So what I'm hearing from this is that we have a business opportunity that we could sell to JetBlue
Right.
to elicit, you know, the willingness to pay and willingness to accept for legroom versus reclining, and then have an efficient allocation of people in the airplane based on those valuations.
Like I would ask my stewardess what the person in row 21 said if I was in row 8. And just hopefully they all trip us back and they can charge more.
I tried this once. I don't actually recommend doing this, by the way, because people just think you're insane. I wasn't actually going to try to recline. I asked the hypothetical question to the person behind me, and I got a blank stare, like no blank stare I've ever seen before. So, you know, if we think about the Coase theorem assumes costless bargaining, and we usually, you know, think about very literal bargaining costs or contracting costs or whatever. There's apparently also a social cost to bargaining because other people think you're insane. So there's just a social norm that contributes there also. That, interestingly enough, we would see a case here where the econs might actually be more pleasant to be around, right? You know, we said the econs might charge you $750 for your pills, but they would also engage in a discussion about efficient allocation of leg space too. So it's sort of situationally dependent whether people's biases or deviations from rationality are pro-social or anti-social, right? And here, you know, I gave that motivating example. Here they're kind of anti-social because they're, you know, leading to fights rather than cooperation and bargaining.
Can I see the questions again?
So here are your questions. So we can think about lining these up with the numbers given on the next slide, right? So the first one, the seat in front of you is currently reclined. So your reference point is you're living in a world where the seat in front of you is back. And it says, all right, how much would you pay to make that seat go up? Meaning, how much would you pay for your legroom? So this guy would be the willingness to pay for legroom. Mm-hmm.
So is the second one independent? Because it kind of says he put a seat up, i.e. like you paid him, because that's how it goes on.
Well, so the first two are the ones that should, for a rational person, give the same answer, right?
No, but so the way I saw the second one was, all right, so we paid him, he put a seat up.
Oh, I didn't mean to say that you actually
So it's
paid him. That's the
independent,
thing.
right? It's
Yeah,
independent.
that they're supposed to be
Okay.
independent. I was just trying to indicate. Okay, now we're in a world where the seat is up. That you didn't necessarily pay him to put this seat up. We're just saying the status quo is the seat is up. I didn't mean to overcomplicate
Okay,
that.
So the first one I said 0 because I don't care.
Okay.
But for the second one, it's like he's consulting me before I was even going to complain about whether he should pay me. So I was
I
like,
might as well pick a number even though I don't care.
Yeah, I know, that's what I did. So I was like, okay, give me $10, whatever. Like, it's kind of weird. I don't know. I guess that's just because how the question was asked, or if it was different in the study or what.
So I tried to be careful with the wording because I said how much would you need to be paid, and what that's. So if you think about willingness to pay and willingness to accept, willingness to pay is the absolute maximum you would pay. Willingness to accept is the absolute minimum you would accept.
Okay.
And that's what I was trying to elicit.
Gotcha.
In a bargaining sense, however, when you're actually doing this, your opening offer probably shouldn't be your willingness to accept.
Yeah.
So when you're saying, hey, give me $10, that doesn't necessarily mean that that was your willingness to accept, right?
Yeah, so that's why.
Yeah, so saying, what is the minimum you would need to be paid in order to not complain?
Yeah.
This is the willingness to accept for loss of legroom. But Spock would argue that these are the same, right?
But actually, it's not the same because the people in front of me, he has a bottom so he can recline at any time he wants. But if I have to complain to bargain with him, so it costs a lot. So it's like for the first question I paid and he reclined down.
Well, so that's what I'm saying. That we want to take these two. I meant for these two to be
Okay.
independent, not like I paid this guy once and now he's just extorting me or something like that. But that's not what I meant to have happen. Okay, so if you think about these as independent, then you're getting away from this fact that I already did this. How many times? Because from a negotiation standpoint, you wouldn't want to be willing to do anything in this second stage, because that's just encouraging the person to keep reclining back and forth and extracting more money from you. That's not the level of complication that I meant. What about this third one? The third and fourth ones are asking about your right to recline, right? Which I said could rationally be very different from your valuation of legroom. So now you want to take a nap. So how much would you pay the person behind you to not complain when you recline your seat? Say, well, that's just your willingness to pay for reclining, right? That's where I might get into a positive willingness to pay territory. Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a red herring, but don't these questions imply that you care about the fact that we complain?
Yeah,
Like someone complains that you recline your seat and you just don't care.
Right, yeah, so, and Spock wouldn't care. So Spock, this has become a somewhat irrelevant thing, but in practice, and that's sort of why I gave this original motivating example, because in practice, people start complaining, and even though you're technically within your rights, the flight attendant comes over and is like, can you not? Because they're just trying to minimize complaining and have the flight not get grounded. And that may not be completely within, that might not be completely in accordance with your rights as a passenger, but in the short term, they're just like, can you just... So, even if you don't necessarily care that someone is complaining, there could be consequences to that, right? But again, not so much the point of the exercise, but in practice, that's something that we have to anticipate, right? That if we take the world as I'm within my rights, I'm doing this, I expect this outcome. If you're expecting everyone around you to behave like econs, you're more likely than not going to be sorely disappointed, right? So even if you yourself see yourself as the rational economic man, it's helpful to understand that other people aren't necessarily. Yeah. And then this last one here is just your willingness to accept, to not recline. And if I, for example, value reclining at $30, I would pay up to, I as Spock, I suppose, I would pay up to $30 to recline. If the person behind me said, hey, I'll pay you more than $30 to not recline, I'd be like, all right, sure, give me the money, I won't recline. That would be, that would be the rational thing to do. As we're seeing, now you can line these guys up. That's not what's happening. That we have, in one case, we're off by more than a factor of 2, and in the other case, we're off by pretty much exactly a factor of 2.